Afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here to the William G. McGowan Theater at the National Archives. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us by YouTube and C-SPAN. Today we're discussing Washington, D.C.'s Civil War forts and parks as we commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Fort Stevens on July 11th and 12th, 1864. In that important battle, Union troops commanded by Major Generals Alexander McCook and Horatio Wright defeated Confederate forces under the command of Lieutenant General Jubal Early, thus preventing the Confederacy from taking Washington. This program is presented in partnership with our friends at the National Capital Planning Commission. This is the third program we have presented with the NCPC, and it's a pleasure to welcome you back. Before we get to today's talk, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs. On Wednesday, July 16th at noon, author Christian McBurney will be here to discuss his book about the Revolutionary War, Kidnapping the Enemies, the Special Operations to Capture Generals Charles Lee and Richard Prescott, and a book signing will follow that program. And on Tuesday, July 29th at 7 p.m., we'll partner with the 2014 March on Washington Film Festival to screen and discuss the 1963 television documentary Crisis Behind a Presidential Commitment. This film chronicles the crisis between the Kennedy administration and Governor George Wallace over the enrollment of two African-American students at the University of Alabama. Following the screening, NPR's Michelle Norris Johnson will moderate a discussion, including Dan Rather and Dr. Sharon Malone, whose sister was one of those two students. If you want to know more about these and all of our upcoming programs, there are copies of our monthly calendar of events in the lobby, as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it physically or virtually. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. In September 2009, President Obama appointed L. Preston Bryant to serve as chairman of the National Capital Planning Commission. Prior to that, he was Secretary of Natural Resources in the cabinet of Virginia Governor Timothy M. Kaine, where he oversaw the Commonwealth's environmental, recreational, wildlife, and historic resource agencies. Before that, Chairman Bryant served in the Virginia House of Delegates for 10 years, and now it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to L. Preston Bryant.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Archivist Ferriero, for hosting us as we look at take this fascinating look into Washington's Civil War history. And on behalf of the National Capital Planning Commission, let me add my welcome to everyone in attendance and watching online. And the Commission's role as the federal government's central planning agency in Washington, D.C. and in the suburbs of Virginia and Maryland, we seek to protect and enhance the capital city's rich historic and cultural resources, which include Fort Circle parks. National Capital Planning Commission, we recently celebrated 90 years since our organization was chartered by Congress. And an interesting historical note relevant to this meeting is that one of NCPC's early responsibilities involved acquiring the property that has become Fort Circle Parks. In terms of what we do, I would like to mention one current project, one relevant also to the National Archives. We just started work on what we call the Pennsylvania Avenue Initiative. And we're working with the General Services Administration and the National Park Service. And through this effort, we will begin to study the near and long-term needs for Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and the Capitol. We will develop a new vision for this iconic street, which is home to so many national treasures, including this building, the National Archives. I want to extend a special thanks to the National Park Service, which is the steward for Fort Circle Parks, and especially recognize Peter May. Peter is a fellow NCPC commissioner, but his day job is as Associate Regional Director for Lands, Resources, and Planning in the National Capital Region. Fort Totten, Fort Reno, Fort DuPont. Locals may recognize these names as parks, neighborhoods, and even metro stations, but many are surprised to learn about their Civil War history. The Civil War, of course, was a milestone in our nation's history. The role of famous battles such as Gettysburg and Antietam are very well known to all of us. But today we're going to learn about another important, albeit less well-known, battle that took place not far from where we are sitting today. Were it not for the earthen defenses built to protect Washington, D.C., and the Battle of Fort Stevens that was fought to defend Washington, D.C., the city of Washington, D.C. could very well be a different place today. And today we'll learn about the development of Washington's Civil War forts, their role in the war, and their ensuing transformation into public parks and cultural resources that today we know as the Fort Circle Parks. So let me begin by introducing you to our terrific group of presenters. Dr. B. Franklin Cooling. He is a well-regarded military and naval historian and a professor of national security studies at the National Defense University's Eisenhower School of National Security and Resource Strategy. He has written extensively on the National Capital Region, Tennessee, and Kentucky, and the roles these regions played in the Civil War. Today, Dr. Cooling will discuss the development of the Civil War defenses of Washington and their impact on the war. Loretta Neumann. She is the co-founder and vice president of the Alliance to Preserve the Civil War Defenses of Washington. She worked for the House Interior Committee, where she handled national parks, public lands, and historic preservation legislation. And during the Clinton administration, she also directed the American Heritage Rivers Initiative at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Today, Ms. Neumann will discuss the post-war impact on the forts, on the surrounding neighborhoods in Washington, and their evolution into parks. And Kim Elder. Ms. Elder is the National Park Service's Program Manager for Civil War Defenses of Washington. She is responsible for the management and the oversight program development of 16 of the remaining forts and batteries owned and operated by the National Park Service. So today, Ms. Elder will highlight the parks today and provide us with a preview of this weekend's activities at Fort Stevens. So let me begin now with Dr. Cooling.
Good afternoon, folks. It's a pleasure to be back in this lovely facility, even if every time I come here I go in the wrong entrance to the National Archives. As a researcher, I became very accustomed over 30 years or more of going in the other side. Well, you don't want to hear about that today. I'll mention the National Archives in just a second in a different context. I am happy to say that for 4 days now, I have listened to the National Park Service and the city in Frederick County regale me with how the Battle of Monocacy saved Washington from Confederate capture. Now, having been privy to this, or also a developer in this legend with a couple of books on Monocacy, I fear that I am also part of the problem. But today I want to tell you that the real battle that saved the city of Washington is what we're going to talk about to some degree. We're going to talk with you this afternoon about Fortress Washington, Abe Lincoln, Fort Stevens, and the battle that really saved the Union on the 11th and 12th of July, 1864. It's ironic that not 50 years plus a month before, 50 years and a month before, I guess that's 49 years and 11 months, but anyway, the British, you will recall, captured Washington and burned the public buildings, setting a day in infamy that was not 9/11 and was not 7 December 1941. 50 years later, an enemy almost did it again. An enemy, even though they were fellow Americans, was the enemy of the state, the enemy of the United States, the Confederacy. We forget both 1814 and 1864, despite an inextricable linkage between then and now through the commemoration of a sesquicentennial and next month the commemoration of a bicentennial. Now let me say this, without the National Archives, and this is not pandering to the Archivists of the United States, without the National Archives, without the National Capital Planning Commission and the National Park Service, the task of remembrance, preservation, which we're going to be speaking of also today, and public use, indeed public recognition, would be infinitely harder. Public records, public planning, and foresight links together then with now and into the future, and we're not there yet for the future, believe me. What we have is using the Laboratory of Historical Site and Event, the records, official and private or unofficial, the awareness, the education, the furthering of agendas is what the sesquicentennial must be about. I listened to Jim Lighthizer, president of the Civil War Trust, yesterday give the opening address at the Monocacy official ceremony, and he pointed to the fact that the preservation of land will outlive all of us, including, of course, machine-readable and print-readable records, surprisingly to say. 1814, go back to 1814. Washington was a small, insignificant village that purported to be the capital of a new nation. It was the seat of government. By 1864, Washington, of course, is much more than that. It is the fortress of Washington, a fortified Mr. Lincoln city, 60-odd or more forts, 93 unarmed batteries, miles of military roads, entrenchments, infrastructure for logistics, hospitals, as well as the political capital of the nation, the United States. Had it not been for 1814 and the Battle of Bladensburg, there would not have been the attention paid by 1864, in part to protecting the city. Indeed, through the intervening years, there had been constructed in the area of the most possible threat to the capital, that is to say the river approach, Fort Washington. By 1861, it was completely neglected and of no use whatsoever in a brothers' war of a civil war, especially where, in fact, Maryland, a southern slaveholding state, was 5 miles away from us right here, surrounding the capital of the Union, or the old United States. By 1864, as I said, there's a ring of fortifications around the city, which happily today are parkland. They're preserved. We have something we can point to from the Civil War and suggest that it's still being employed usefully for the city and the population today, nationally, locally, and the residents of the District of Columbia. Now, these were unearthed, or I should say these were earthen fortifications. Fort Washington was a masonry, coastal defense fortification. But these were field fortifications thrown up by infantrymen, by artillerymen, white, black contrabands, hired labor. We had private military contractors even back then. You might say maybe Halliburton didn't have anything to do with it, but it's interesting to think about. An interlocking communication system of signals, telegraph, roads, wagon parks, storehouses, arsenals. Where I work at National Defense University was the old Washington Arsenal that figured prominently in this story. But why do we consider this symbol, sword, and shield, symbol of the Union, Washington, D.C., the shield that protected, the fortifications that protected the city, and the sword, the Union armies in the field that were supposed to work together with these fortifications, as important in our particular story? By 1864, these forts and the heavy armament down at Fort Foote, which you must visit because it's a superb fort restored and preserved with the heavy ordnance of the period. By 1864, we have an episode that is, as the Duke of Wellington would have declared if he'd been here, instead of about Waterloo, he would have said about Fort Stevens, it was a damned close-run thing. Despite lessons learned, despite all these fortifications, despite the thousands of public dollars expended on this fortification system, it was the critical summer of 1864, a critical month of July, 10 critical days, of which right now, if we had been in the city at this particular time, haven't gotten there yet. Give me a chance, huh? If we had been here on July 10th, 1864, we would be panicked in the streets without air conditioning, without refrigeration, because the rebels were close enough to be in Rockville, Gaithersburg, and on up the line to the Monocacy. But we're here today. This was the third Confederate invasion of Northern Territory in the stalemated war. But it was a pretty critical pre-election summer for the President of the United States. And after all, Abraham Lincoln was a man beset by the same kind of problems as President Obama has, a not-so-loyal opposition of his own party, called the Radicals, that had sent to him by this date a drastic Reconstruction bill that would have been punitive and completely unpalatable to his scheme of Reconstruction, the Wade Davis bill. This period of time was the storied risk-taking attempt by Robert E. Lee to change the strategic balance here in the war in the East, not just militarily, but also politically, though militarily Robert E. Lee thought predominantly through the stage of his whole career. He wanted to break the stranglehold of Ulysses S. Grant and others on the Richmond-Petersburg line. And of course, you may recall in the West, the Atlanta campaign had become bogged down. On the coastlines, Mobile Bay and Wilmington, North Carolina, and other places had not been blockaded effectively by the Union. In fact, in this critical election summer of 1864, everything was kind of at a standstill. The war had not been won after Gettysburg. Forget Gettysburg, forget Antietam, forget emancipation. It all hung in the balance. It all hung in the balance on an afternoon here at Fort Stevens when Jubal Early, my favorite Confederate general, hard swearing, had children out of wedlock, spit tobacco, Lee's bad old man, of which I have a biography coming out shortly, pointing out many of his foibles, but he was a fighter. And he was the last thing that Robert E. Lee had as an instrument for changing the war, and he appeared here at Fort Stevens by noon on July 11th, the day tomorrow, with about 8 to 10, maybe 12,000 men, battle-hardened veterans, and was becoming the game changer here in this war in the East. How close the invasion, the timeline, the citizen soldier, the lawyer in uniform, Jubal Early, who opposed secession, but went with his state, much like Robert E. Lee, never understood that because he was a West Pointer. After the war in Canada, he used to look across at Fort Niagara and complain about that barber pole flag, the American flag, that he had to look at every morning. Well, he swore allegiance to it when he graduated West Point, so I don't have much truck for Early in his comments on the American flag. How close? It's all a matter of speed, all a matter of delays. The delays begin for this previous week, starting with the 4th of July, when Early's men enjoy the repast that's set out for them by the Union soldiers up at Harper's Ferry and Martinsburg and so forth. And he loses 3 days. He loses another day at Frederick. Monocacy, yes, a battle that cost him the services of one of his best divisions. But Jubal Early, by this time, has become the Confederate incarnate, not just the Confederate in the attic, but the Confederate incarnate of hard war. He's the great extortionist of the Civil War. He decides he's going to extort capital from all these northern cities, and particularly by 64, Maryland cities like Hagerstown and Middletown and Frederick, and he wastes a lot of time when his primary mission is to get to Washington, change the scope of the war, capture the city, disperse the Lincoln administration. But he's dialing around at Frederick, extracting 200 grand from him. Okay, priorities. The flukes of nature, a second factor. On July 10th, the thermometer out here at Georgetown University or up in Maryland at a farm near Sandy Springs stood in the mid-90s. The drought had been in the region for weeks on end. Water was in short supply, and the marching columns went through 6-inch dust on even a macadamized highway, but certainly not what we have now with I-270. Probably took them just as long to get through the dust as we do going up 270. Just about as unpleasant, too. But all these delays get to our main point about the Battle of Fort Stevens, and I don't want to go on too long because we've got other things we want to talk about this afternoon. Fort Stevens had been set up as Fort Massachusetts based on a Camp Brightwood out here in the Brightwood section of Washington as early as 1861. And after the previous invasion of Maryland in 1862, they expanded Fort Massachusetts, who obviously had been built by Massachusetts soldiers, volunteers in part, into Fort Stevens. You can still see, and we'll talk about that, the parapet, the restored parapet there at Fort Stevens, but otherwise everybody goes out to Fort Stevens. Well, where's the fort? Where's the fort? Either thinking they're going to find a western stockade or more like Fort McHenry or Fort Washington. But Fort Stevens was an expanded earthen fort with a stockaded backside to it called a stockaded gorge. That saved labor and money and all that sort of thing. Had 19 guns. It was manned by this time not by veteran artillerists, but 150 day men out of Ohio who had come to enable the artillerists to be shipped to Grant as cannon fodder for the battles in Virginia. Now, interestingly enough, these 150 day men that manned Fort Stevens were the equal to those heavy artillerists because the remaining garrisons had trained these 150 day people. Well, let me just tell you one moment in time before I kind of wrap this thing up and we let Loretta and Kim have at it here. It's early afternoon of July 11th, Monday afternoon, the moment when the two forces will meet at Fort Stevens. There's Early's men coming in from Frederick, and there are reinforcements finally coming up from the Petersburg lines by boat that are down at the docks at 6th Street. At this very moment, Jubal Early rides down what we know of as Georgia Avenue. It's the 7th Street Road, and at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, one of the great travesties of our time, giving up Walter Reed so we can create more traffic congestion in Bethesda. Walter Reed is situated on what is going to become a battlefield, the only battlefield in the District of Columbia. Jubal Early, hunched over from arthritis due to the Mexican War and the do's and damps, pulls out his binoculars and peers down at Fort Stevens and the Union lines. From his left, Fort Slocum, to his right, which would have been Fort DeRussy, which you can still visit in Rock Creek Park. He peers through the binoculars and he senses the moment of opportunity to change the course of the war, my career, American history, and the future of the Confederacy beckons. Right then and there. Can you imagine that career opportunity for any of us at that time? Not Robert E. Lee, not Ulysses S. Grant, Jubal Early. Who's ever heard of him? Anyway, soldiers knew him. The enemy finally was going to know about him. And he turns to bring up his army, and there's no army that he can bring up because of the heat and the dust, and they're straggling all the way back up almost to the Monocacy, certainly by Gaithersburg. Would we have pressed that issue? Here's all you folks that are budding managers and leaders. Here's your moment. Would you have pushed the momentum and found something more than a corporal's guard to go forward and push through those thinly held lines at the time? Jubal Early doesn't. Maybe he was just as tired and jaded and fatigued. He hated the Yankees by this stage, but he couldn't push forward. So what does he do next best? What most of us would have done. He retires back to Silver Spring, the sylvan mansion of Francis Preston Blair, and the sylvan little spring there, and the rum cellar, and he calls command conference to wait developments. He loses the initiative here at Fort Stevens. Well, the next day, and in fact that day, the man who doesn't lose an initiative, not that he's necessarily my hero, but he doesn't lose the initiative, Abraham Lincoln. Abe, the consummate adolescent, comes out to Fort Stevens to see what's going on. He also wants to come out to Fort Stevens to be with his boys. They vote. If you think Lincoln was not a consummate politician, then you're maybe a little too idealistic. But in any case, he comes out, so he's there on the first day, July 11th. Second day he comes out, and he comes up to the fort, right, the rear end of the fort, and Horatio Wright, who was mentioned to us before, is the 6th Corps commander who's brought his troops in there. And Horatio Wright says, Mr. President, I'm so happy to see you here. Would you like to see a battle? Would you like to see a battle? And no sooner are the words out of his mouth, and he realizes, oops, that could be his career, because, good heavens, the president go up on those ramparts, gets shot. And think about it. Who becomes vice president? Never heard of Hannibal Hamlin. What happens to the nation? What happens to the city? Et cetera, et cetera. All kind of things that can happen. Well, Abe goes up there, nearly gets shot. Maybe not where that boulder is placed today, and maybe not in that configuration. The great what-ifs of history that are based on the records and legend and myth and storytelling, much as like I'm telling you some stories today. Historians are great. You know, history never repeats itself. Historians just repeat each other. In any case, Lincoln is almost shot. A surgeon from the 102nd Pennsylvania is cut down nearby, but again, a missed opportunity for the Confederacy. Yes, Lincoln was nearly shot. Early's escape that evening was planned by the time he realized he could not breach these defenses here at Fort Stevens, because Wright and his troops had come in from Grant's army. And of course, this episode slightly scathes, or certainly does nothing much for Lincoln's reelection chances that summer. In fact, Abraham Lincoln probably had on his mind those days the Wade Davis Reconstruction Bill more than anything else, the fate of his Secretary of State's one son who was nearly captured and was wounded at Monocacy, and the political chances of reelection. Remember the blind memorandum by August in this deadly summer of near defeat, largely because of Early before Washington. The president gets his cabinet to sign on the back of a memorandum saying that they don't know it, but he promises to that everybody will abide by the succession that will come when he thinks he's not going to get reelected. Military incompetence on the northern side. The North is taken aback, and in fact there are denunciations that maybe Lincoln set this whole episode up for some reason. Geez, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Conspiracy theory. A scathing criticism of the war entirely. I mean, Sherman's going nowhere, Grant's going nowhere, the Navy's going nowhere. Only the Confederates seem to be going somewhere, and they blinked before Washington, but they escaped. They escaped, and so it falls to a autumn campaign in the Shenandoah Valley and a change of command that will occur up here at Monocacy Junction in August that brings that team together of Grant, Sheridan, and Early's demise. Early, of course, pulling out of the lines on the 12th, turns to his staff and he drawls, well, gentlemen, I guess we scared Abe Lincoln like hell. And according to his aide, Henry Kyd Douglas, Douglas, who represents most of the Confederate force at this time, is ticked off because they didn't get into Washington and they didn't capture aid. And he turns to his superior and he says, well, General, on the afternoon of the 12th, when this, and you can see on the map here, these couple of brigades came out against us in a counter-assault, there was somebody else that was pretty scared like hell, I suspect. And old Julie spits out of the side of his mouth and utters a couple more profanities and says, yeah, I guess so, but it ain't going to make it into the history books. Well, it has made it into the history books, even if not via official records. In any case, the memoirs, the reminiscences, which flesh out the official records. And in fact, I venture to tell you, there are probably more records in the National Archives now that are not in the official records of the War of the Rebellion published by the War Department and a Navy counterpart for the benefit mostly of the veterans after the war, though the military also used them in war planning. And there's probably more that can be found on this thing. Let me wrap up by suggesting this. Grant may have declared that Early's lost opportunity did change his summer plans, if only to finally force Grant to seal the Achilles heel of the Shenandoah Valley and the approach to Washington. The soldiers in these forts, for days after Early was long gone back to the Shenandoah Valley, were still cleaning up, not the battlefield necessarily, which they did, but cleaning up the overgrown and neglected fortifications, kind of locking the barn door after the horse had been stolen, if you will. Make no mistake, however, to a number of these Union veterans, the high water mark of the Confederacy was not Vicksburg, it was not Gettysburg, it was a little toll gate house, at the corner of Georgia Avenue and Piney Branch Road. That was the fullest extent that the Confederate forces here at Fort Stevens came on the afternoon of July 11th and 12th to capturing Washington, changing the course of the war and the course of us today, quite frankly. The works have eroded. We're going to hear about that in a little bit in a moment. We don't yet really know where Lincoln stood. I think he stood all over the place. Lincoln never stood still. He was behind the ramparts. He was up on the ramparts. He was over the Fort Massachusetts portion. He was over at Fort Stevens. But we really don't know for sure, despite the lovely stone and bas-relief out there at Fort Stevens on the parapet, where the veterans years later remembered seeing Lincoln. I'm 75 years of age, folks. I remember things differently than when I was fighting or something like that at 20, 18, or what have you. So who knows? The veterans may have been mistaken. But they wanted to mark that spot, and they got the stone out of the Walter Reed area, Cameron Creek, and brought it up there, one of the ugliest monuments in Washington, put that bas-relief on there, and that's their monument. That's their monument to the remembrance of Lincoln under enemy fire. We don't know that Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the Justice of the Supreme Court, really uttered one of those immortal words, "Get that damn fool down." The records suggest, that is to say the reminiscences and so forth, suggest there were 5 or 6 other people, veterans as well as the owner of the Fort Stevens property, that also shouted, "Get that fool down, get that man down," including Horatio Wright finally got the chief executive down because he told him he couldn't protect him. "Mr. President, I can't protect you. I can't guarantee your protection." So finally, Lincoln condescendingly gets down off his perch. Urbanized Washington took over the last Civil War battlefield. Still, Washington forts are yet another of Washington's many monuments that have transitioned in purpose, testament to survival of national unification, and particularly Fort Stevens in its decisive battle. They warrant recognition from all of us, appreciation, commemoration after 150 years for what they did there. And probably both sides lost over 1,000 people in casualties, many of whom, or some of whom at least, are buried at Battleground National Cemetery and the little Confederate cemetery at Grace Episcopal Church out in Silver Spring. So just what they have become and what those soldiers wrought there 150 years ago certainly warrant our gratitude today, our recognition, and some consideration in the pantheon of heroes of the nation, heroes of the Southern Confederacy, including the general officers as well as the enlisted personnel, the veterans who came back like Lewis Cass White did from the 102nd Pennsylvania after the war, worked in the Pension Bureau, the most immediate great entitlement program, built a house, and helped preserve what Loretta is going to tell you about right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Frank. He is amazing. Everything I'm going to show you, and I'm the picture girl, I've learned from him and a few others like him, but mainly from Frank. And especially for the Civil War defenses of Washington, there is a Bible, and it's Frank's, and Wally Owens, his co-author, wrote Mr. Lincoln's Forts. And if you really care about these issues, that's the book to read. I wish I'd brought it with me, but I encourage you to get that book. So what I'm going to do is give you a little story. I'm going to go as fast as I can. The nice thing about YouTube is you can watch it later and pause, and then you can look at these at your leisure. So you don't and you can read faster than I can talk, so I'm not going to just read what's on these slides. I just want you to see these beautiful places that I love, both their history and also as parks and recreation and natural resources. And frankly, the lungs of the city are largely these forts and the parks. So there we start. And as Frank said, the city was unprotected down below. This is Fort Washington. If you haven't been there, you should go. But it's quite different from the forts that were built during the Civil War. And after Bull Run, Lincoln knew that the city was vulnerable, and that's when he ordered Major General John G. Barnard to design this series of forts around the city to protect it. So here they are, and these are the ones that were there then. You can see it was quite an amazing feat to build all those, and they did them very, very quickly. It was just tremendous. And here they are today. I've circled on here on this old map the ones that are under government ownership today. The Park Service owns all the ones that are in Washington, D.C., plus one in Maryland and one in Virginia. And then the ones in Virginia are owned by local governments, and you'll see some of them as well. And another part of the story, and it's historic as well, is in 1902, Senate McMillan Commission report on the parks. They were planning for parks in D.C., and one of their major recommendations had to do with the Civil War defenses of Washington. They saw that these forts, which were highly placed, were both beautiful to look at and they were beautiful to look from. And they saw these as potential parks, and linking them up with the Fort Circle Drive, which they proposed and which Congress funded into the 1930s. And I have a newspaper article that says that all but about 1 mile of it was bought. So there's land linking all of those forts. And these are all the different forts, and they're under 3 different management systems, unfortunately, and it's something that we're hoping to change. Eleanor Holmes Norton has introduced legislation, bipartisan, with Congressman Frank Wolf, a Republican from Virginia, to establish the Civil War Defenses of Washington National Historical Park and have it under its own superintendent and hopefully its own staff, and we'll be able to do the things that we would like to see done. But I'm going to give you quickly, here's Fort Stevens, some historical photos so you can see what Frank was telling you about. And it's just quite an amazing place. And the thing I like to note, and there'll be a few other slides you'll see too, is the farmland. All this was farmland around it, just some houses, and many of them got hit by the shells and burnt. But here it is today. The CCC in the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps, reconstructed much of Fort Stevens, and you can get the flavor of what it was like back then. It's well worth a visit. Has cannons, has a magazine over here, and the boulder. Sorry I didn't get a picture of the boulder, but it's there too. It was also important in African Americans' history, and then and now. It was the earliest black settlement in D.C., and this woman, Elizabeth Thomas, she was a free African American, owned 11 acres, and I think back then women didn't tend to own land at all, and a free black woman is really unusual, and her land was taken for Fort Stevens. And just down from Fort Stevens is this land right here. This goes right up, the fort's behind those trees. This was private property. It was threatened with a townhouse development. It was awful, and some of us got together and said, we've got to do something. We got the National Park Trust to buy it and get it added to the Fort Stevens. Down here are 2 more African American historically significant properties, and I encourage you later to read about them, the Military Road School and the Lightfoot House. Now here is a map, and I think this will help best of all knowing around Fort Stevens, because the battle, well, all of the fortifications kind of manned up. They didn't know if the Confederates might go down from the south or something, but they were coming from the north. So it's this whole range up here, the northern tier, that came into play. And it starts down, here's Fort Bunker Hill, and that's in Brookland. Here's Fort Totten, the metro station, so you should know that. Fort Slocum is in Manor Park, which is a neighbor of ours. We live my husband and I, in Tacoma. Fort Stevens, we live up here. Here's Fort Stevens, so we're just very close. Fort DeRussy is in here. Fort DeRussy was in play, very much so. And Fort Reno. Fort Reno was huge. I mean, you'll see a picture of that in a moment. And it was, and I didn't I also have down here Fort Bayard and Battery Kimball, and you'll see some pictures of others. But anyway, Fort Bunker Hill, here's quickly, it's a square block, and it's high. And the Park Service is now repairing the trails that lead up there, so it should be a great recreation spot, even though it doesn't have any of the defenses are left. And leading from there, coming into where Fort Totten is this stretch of land, and it's along Gallatin Street, and that's part of the land that was bought for the Fort Circle Drive. There is a drive along it here, but I suppose they would have put it in the middle. I'm glad they didn't. This is leading into Fort Totten. Here's the metro station. The high hills of the actual fort are up here, and there are defenses in that fort. And then this is part of the Fort Circle Drive land. Here's Fort Totten, some historical photographs. And you'll notice that I have in every one of these, I've tried to get the real person's name for. The more I study this and the more I get to learn, I love the land, I love the parks, I love all that, but these are real people, and so I'm trying to bring the human element into this story as well. And here's the cannons and real people who manned them. Fort Totten today, well, unfortunately, it's not doing so well. The entrance is closed off. When I first started taking pictures about 15 years ago, this gate was open, but they closed it when they had some trouble, and they've never opened it since. There's erosion from dirt bikers who love to come and this is a real defense, the earthworks there. And then, but it's beautiful land. It's huge, too, and could be a magnificent park. But it needs staffing, and it needs resources, and it needs programs, and it needs what the Park Service does best, run parks. Fort Slocum, it's in Manor Park, as I mentioned before. Here again, so you could see around it, this was all farmland. The U.S. Colored Infantry was there, and these are some white officers here, but behind are the NCOs that were African American. At Fort Slocum today, there's really nothing left of the defenses there, but there's a great park. And I frankly think just interpreting it, if they could get a cannon there and have and now and then at least have a ranger come and give a talk there for the people who live around it, they could learn about it. This is part of the Fort Circle Drive land, again, that was never built on in the middle, but there's along the side, and it makes a lovely boulevard. Fort DeRussy, you just got to go to Fort DeRussy. It's so beautiful. It's in Rock Creek Park. It's along, this is Military Road. You come up to Oregon Avenue, and you just drive in and pull off. It's very easy to find. There's this huge tree when you go to the Nature Center and walk down towards Fort DeRussy, and they call this a witness tree because they think it possibly was there during the battle. Sometimes when they got cut off, the trees grew back, so it might have been a regrowth, but it still is about 150 years old. Here are the earthworks there. They're massive, and you can go all the way around. My picture doesn't do justice. And some hiking trails. It's just a terrific park. Again, Fort Reno. Fort Reno is the highest point in D.C., and then on top of that, to boot, they had this tower. So when up here, they could see the dust, the Confederates coming, and they knew that, we were in trouble. But similarly, when Jubal Early looked out of his eyeglass at Fort Reno, he said, oops, that is really pretty well fortified, and it's high, and it's big, and it's strong. I don't think I want to go there. And then he turned down Beard's Mill and came on Georgia Avenue to Fort Stevens. And here's the modern Fort Reno. Now, even though there's nothing left of the defenses there, if you climb up to the top, which I did, and you take this, that's Virginia in the distance. It's evocative. You can really feel like what it might have been like. Just kind of close your eyes and blink a little. It's definitely worth a visit. And nearby is more land. It's still a huge parkland. Again, some land that was bought for the Civil War defenses, the Fort Circle Parks. And I took this just a couple weeks ago, and I'm driving along here. This is on 36th Street, and I'm looking down here. I'm thinking, what a beautiful wilderness in the city. Amazing, great space. This is more manicured, but this is terrific too. I thought, I guess people don't use it as a park. And then I saw this guy over here. I looked over here, and sure enough, here's a guy on the tree reading a Kindle book or something, I guess. Politics and Prose is not far away. That's a park. Battery Kimball, Park Service doesn't like this. The community loves it for dog walking. Back in these trees are some defenses that remain, and it's well worth a visit. It's a beautiful area. And that was to guard the Chain Bridge, which was the only fixed bridge between Washington and Harper's Ferry, so it was very important. And across the river on the Potomac is the only fort that the Park Service has today that's in Virginia, Fort Marcy. And it was built, again, to the chain bridge and protect Leesburg Pike. And it's got massive, pretty good-sized defenses there. Not much interpretation, if any, a little. But so if you know what you're seeing, you know where to go, you can enjoy it. That's something I would love to see in the future, that it be better interpreted. And then crossing the Anacostia to the other side of the river, but before you're going, this beautiful land up here. Those are all the Fort Circle parks, the land, connecting land, and then the forts. And I gave this to the National Capital Planning Commission when they had a hearing on the expansion of the Hyde Act in D.C. And I said, think about what would happen if buildings were high here. It would destroy the view of that. And then looking from those places out, and you're going to see a couple of pictures of them, views, how terrible it would be to just destroy this great vista. Now, here are the ones on the side of the Anacostia. I'm not going to show you every one of them, but at least you'll get a flavor, and you'll see how beautiful they are, how historic they are, and the potential that they have. We're going to start down at the bottom at Fort Foote and work our way up. So here's Fort Foote, and this is one of my favorites, and it was Frank's too. It was high over the river. You can see this beautiful vista there. President Lincoln did go out and visit it. It's historically very important. And here's me under this cannon, and not to show off me so much as to show you how big these cannons are. And these are the real cannons. You see the picture down here. They had fallen down the ravine, but they got put back up in the 80s, and it's a wonderful place to go. It's about halfway between Washington and D.C. and Fort Washington, about 6 miles down. Here's Fort Stanton, and to enter it, you have to come through Our Lady of Perpetual Help Catholic Church's driveway, and then you get on their parking lot. Some of the earthworks did get destroyed to build that building back there. But you have this view. Now, this is the view I took in 2003 when I started getting involved with the Park Service on these things. And last fall, here is the same view, and it was all covered. And I complained to Kim Elder, the program manager you'll meet in a moment, about it. And she fought and fought and fought. And she said she wanted it by 4th of July to have it cut. And sure enough, I went the other day and took this picture. It's even better than it was before, so thank you, Kim. And this is not part of the Fort Circle Parks. It's not part of the Civil War defenses of Washington. But nobody can go up to Fort Stanton and not drop by and see the Frederick Douglass National Historical Site. He was too important in African American history. A former slave, an abolitionist, and a speaker, and a statesman afterwards. And the house is fabulous. And then down the way is Fort Ricketts. Again, there's stuff behind there. You can see picnic table, though. And then behind in the trees, there are defenses still there. Here's Fort Davis. This is the only part of the Fort Drive that was ever constructed. It was done during the CCC era in 1935, and here's a picture of it being built. It's overgrown, but you can still go there and see and get what the defenses looked like, what those earthworks were like. Here's Fort DuPont, which is the second largest park in D.C., and it has problems with exotic vegetation. So our hope is that, I don't know what, I'm not the kind of person that can tell you what to do about exotic vegetation, but it does hurt the earthworks, so something should be done. But here's on the Fort Circle Parklands, in those hills, all over the area east of the Anacostia, these beautiful plants, native plants, endangered species that are up there. A ranger told me that people drive all the way to the Shenandoah Mountains to see the mountain laurel in the spring, and you can walk up in those hills and see those. So it's well worth a visit. And there are hikes. This is a hike I went on with the Sierra Club, and they go quite regularly. And in fact, this afternoon there will be one leaving from Fort DeRussy at about 4 o'clock and ending up at Fort Stevens. If you would like to join them, you can do that. Just go to the Nature Center at the Park Service at Rock Creek. Fort Chaplin, it's got a park. It's more of a park than a historic site, but it's a wonderful park. And then here are the ones that are in Virginia and Maryland that are owned by local governments. And real quick, I'll just go fast. This is Battery Bailey. I love Battery Bailey. It's just a little one. It was just a battery. If you know, a battery was just a place where they had a platform where they could put a cannon there. They weren't garrisoned. There weren't troops that stayed there all the time. But it's just very charming, and there are a lot of these displays about what it did look like, and it's interesting. It's right off Mass Avenue as you go out of the city. Fort Ethan Allen, just this spring, they have done a wonderful job of interpretation, improving their earthworks, but also doing some interpretation. They had a fabulous event. Here's C.F. Smith. Another one here. Hey, this is what it was. This is historic. But this is there now, and they also have bathrooms there. You know, we don't have those at Fort Stevens. Fort Ward. This is the gem of them all, I have to say. I hate to admit it, but it is. It's big, and it's been restored. About 90% of the earthworks are restored, and it has a great museum. It's in Alexandria. Alexandria owns it and runs it. Terrific. I mean, the displays are great. And they're also doing a lot of history on the African-American story there, which I won't get into. It's very controversial, but they're at least trying now to make up for past wrongs. Fort Willard, this is the cutest little thing. It's just a traffic circle with people around. But look what they did. They say, here, these are earthworks. Those are ruins. Here's a cannon. And, you know, kind of squint your eyes, and you feel like you're back then. And then this is Fort Stevens this weekend. Now, this is what it was the last couple years. Every year, the closest date, we have an event. Kim's called me. The one this year is going to be those on steroids. I mean, she's going to tell you about it, but it's going to be fabulous. And here's Kim, and this is our alliance group. We're the president, Susan Claffey, and our treasurer, Gary Thompson, and me. It's real important to have advocates, and that's what we are for the Alliance to Preserve the Civil War Defenses of Washington. We're 6 years old. We're fighting very hard for that legislation. We hope you'll help us support it, and I thank you for the chance to speak.
Well, again, good afternoon. I just want to, again, thank our host, the National Archives, for hosting us and having all these folks here today to talk about the Civil War forts of Washington. I'd like to, again, thank our sister agency, the NCPC. And, again, I'm going to click this button here. Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay. So as been alluded to, my colleagues here have alluded to, we've got a lot of great things going on in these forts, and we are ready to tell that story. This is a great point in history, the 150th anniversary of this Battle of Fort Stevens, the only Civil War battle fort in Washington, D.C. And over the next couple of days, we're going to have lots of activities planned at the grounds of Fort Stevens, including at the Battleground National Cemetery, the second smallest national cemetery, also managed by the National Park Service. There are 38 Union soldiers buried there, and it's a lovely place to come out and visit, and we'll have some events there on this coming Sunday. But I do want to point out that many of you all may have gotten a copy of this commemorative program here. It's just not Fort Stevens, but the entire sort of campaign or the attack on Washington by Jubal Early. It's all here. We ask that you just take a look at it, and if you have an opportunity to come out and visit with us, please do so. So as we've noted, just this week, today and tomorrow, we've got a lot of great things going on. We just learned that C-SPAN will be out on tomorrow evening at Fort Stevens to cover the Civil War Historians Roundtable. We have noted speakers for that. And then as Loretta sort of alluded to, we're looking at Fort Stevens Day, which we've been hosting in my tenure for the last 3 years, Fort Stevens Day on steroids. We're going to have Mr. Lincoln there, Mrs. Lincoln there. We're going to have Nicolay, and we will be firing a cannon from Fort Stevens. The first time in 150 years a cannon will be fired at a D.C. fort, so you've got to come out and share in with that. And as I mentioned, on Sunday, we'll have the memorial program at the Battleground National Cemetery, where we will pay respect to those 38 soldiers who were buried there and the many, many others who have given the ultimate sacrifice for this country. So again, I know that we didn't have a lot of time, and I'm not sure if we're going to be able to open it up for questions, but I do encourage you all to tell your friends about it. Visit us on our website at www.mps.gov/CWDW, the Civil War Defenses of Washington. And again, thank you all so very much.
I think we have time for just one or two questions. If people would like to come to either of the microphones, if folks have questions, and we'll go ahead and take them in turn. So if you can just give us a minute, sir. Please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm David Balducci. Thank you for all three of you for your presentations. I'd like to ask a little bit more about the legislation. You alluded to it, but I wonder if you could get into it just a little bit deeper and maybe focus on how the local government-owned Virginia forts will be incorporated into that plan.
Thanks. Is this on? I take it you're from Virginia. What the bill would do, we try to make it revenue neutral. So basically, it's redesignating these existing forts, the ones that the Park Service owns, as a National Historical Park. But it also provides for cooperative agreements with the other locally owned forts. So the 4 in Virginia and the 1 in Maryland. And then also with private owners. There's still some where private owners have portions of old forts on them. We'd like to get better signage, even where the forts aren't there now. For example, I went out a few weeks ago with my husband, Dan Smith, who's here, and he loves to go with me photographing. And I said, there's a Fort Bennett. I want to find that. That's in Virginia. And there was a sign. They have a lovely sign there that says Fort Bennett. And there's a little ravine over on the side. And I thought, well, maybe that ravine was there, even though there's a big apartment building right there where the fort probably was. So yes, we will have things. And also, it will study ways to have a place in Washington, which we don't have, to study and commemorate the entire Civil War, and both sides, Confederates and Union. Thanks.
I'd like to ask a question about the compensation for folks' land when we set up the forts. I talked to the ranger at the Fort Stevens site, and she was saying she wasn't compensated. So I'm interested to know how we got the land then and how to set up the forts and what practices were in place at that time, what law was in place.
Well, Loretta alluded to the fact that we had, and Dr. Coolin as well, a free black woman by the name of Elizabeth Thomas, who owned a little over 11 acres of land. And just what we would just consider today would be eminent domain. They came through and they took the property. What we don't have is proof that she was actually compensated. But again, you can do that in a time of war, and that's exactly what happened. Unfortunately, we don't know if
You
she
might
was
tell
ever
about some of the other ones.
And the rest of all those forts, it were the same practice?
This was called the law of military necessity. In time
Okay.
of war, you could take the property.
Okay.
The descendants of Aunt Betty, Elizabeth Thomas, have always taken what she would tell veterans groups years later that President Lincoln promised her a great reward. She never got a great reward, and everybody's been aghast ever since, and the descendants will tell you they've never seen any reward at all in records and so forth. The property owners at the end of the war received back the land if they could prove it was their land, and basically the timber and what was remaining in the forts that could be utilized. They could put in claims for damages, and in fact the claims after the war, Record Group 92 I think it is, in archives, and there are a couple of other record groups, is where you go to find the records of what had happened. And this was universally used in the South, wherever the military had occupied land and destroyed property, fences, barns, everything else.
I see.
And so that is kind of the story there. For a period of months after the end of the war, Appomattox, for example, some of these forts were actually retained with garrisons. And then gradually the fears of any resurgence of the rebellion or the threat from the French in Mexico or the British or whoever, the Army realized it was taking up a lot of money keeping these things, and so they got rid of them. Fort Foote, however, retained its garrison into the 1870s, and there were batteries in the Spanish-American War, and of course Fort Washington, even more recently, was still an active post.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, I think you'll be our last question.
I was wondering if you were familiar or could help me with a question I've had for years and years. When Jubal Early approached Washington, cavalry patrols were sent out on both the east and west sides of the city. In fact, there was an expedition to try and free the prisoners down at Point Lookout, which came to nothing. But the one that always intrigued me was a cavalry regiment on the western side of Washington who really were a little lost and didn't know where they were, reported that they entered one of the forts, found it completely unmanned, went up on the ramparts and could see the White House and the Capitol in the distance. Do you think there's any credibility to that report, and what fort could that possibly have been?
Let me explain. There are about 3 legends that you've wrapped into one. The John McCausland's cavalry of Early's army came down the Rockville Pike, and we're not sure yet why Early deviates or diverts over to via Veers Mill Road over to the 7th Street Road and Georgia Avenue. And you should go up to Monocacy for, if no other reason. There's a Jedediah Hotchkiss map that's on display out of the Library of Congress. It's dated April 1864. It is obviously taken from a Union Corps of Engineer map, etc. But whether or not Hotchkiss had this and presented it to Early so that he could come and see where to get into Washington, we don't know. It's a great mystery. Mysteries are still surfacing all over the place in the official records or unofficial. McCausland had on his staff a young chap by the name of Loughborough. Some of you who are Washingtonians will realize Loughborough Road is named after the Loughborough family that up near American University had their property. Jim Johnston, a Washington lawyer, has written a history or taken a diary of that family. Loughborough ostensibly took McCausland during the evening of July 11th through the lines up to what was Fort Gaines at American University, had dinner at his family place, and ostensibly they looked down on, quote-unquote, the dome of the lights of the Capitol. McCausland was happy to tell this story to General Grant when Grant was in the White House after the war, and you can just imagine Grant chomping on his cigar and, right. For years, nobody believed it. The Confederate soldiers themselves claimed to have seen the dome of the Capitol. That was pure hokum. There's nowhere you can see the dome of the Capitol. If you know up on Meridian Heights, you can see the dome is below where visual would have gotten it out in Silver Spring or what have you. Probably saw the lights of Georgetown. But McCausland apparently had snuck through the lines on that night and gotten up there with Loughborough. Nobody else that we know of. John B. Gordon claims to have rode up on the lines in broad daylight. No way of substantiating that. There again, the old soldiers have vivid memories, and this is the origins of your stories there.
One more little comment, then I'll go. This is not a question, but I was a surveyor in Washington, D.C., a land surveyor for 42 years. And in our office, we had the 1880, I think, USGS topographic maps, the first topographic maps of the city ever put out by the federal government, and the fortifications are still on there in 1880. Yeah. It was cool set of maps. If you haven't seen those, I think Library of Congress has them. You want to go look at them.
Good. Thanks.
Well, with that, I'd like to again thank the National Archives for hosting this really wonderful event. Our speakers, Dr. Frank Cooling, Loretta Neumann, Kim Elder. Please join me one last time in a round of applause for them, and thank you.
Thank you. Good. Let's set the stage. Good questions.
Yes.